The modern data platform looks almost nothing like a traditional database, and it can take any number of shapes and sizes. The key is that it delivers the data to the right people at the right time in the right way.
The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. Yet. Today's world teems with innovation. The nexus of hardware, software, and human ingenuity promises a revolution in possibilities. What does tomorrow look like? Witness future proof.
Your host, Eric Kavanaugh here. And today I'm going to talk to a good friend of mine, Maurice Karlakian, and his colleague, Alexander Bouchard. They're from a company called HookDeck, and it's all about web hooks. So quickly, what is a webhook? Well, lots of people know what an API is, application program interface. A webhook is kind of the opposite. It's sort of a push notification for the web. And we're going to find out what that means and why there's a company that focuses just on managing webhooks. That's a good sign that we're moving in a positive direction here. So let's bring in my good buddy, Maurice Karlakian from HookDeck. Maurice, tell us a bit about webhooks. What are they, and why did you decide to join with Alexander and launch this company?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Nice to be on the show again. So it's a webhook, as you so well explained, is basically the equivalent of an API, but from the platform that wants to send some real-time events. So when usually platforms like Shopify, for instance, wants to send a notification about something happening on the platform, in order to avoid you as the consumer pulling their API every so amount of time, let's say 5, 10, 15, 20 seconds, whatever it is, and depending how quickly you want the information, they will actually send you an HTTP notification. That's called a webhook, and the term was coined a few years ago. I don't remember by who exactly, but the idea behind it is that it's to avoid basically overloading their API and just sending the information as you need it and as it happens in real time. So the reason why, and I'll let Alex also expand on that, but the reason why there's a company that focuses on this and we created HookDeck is because we realized that a lot of people were just basically recreating the same solution over and over again to handle that influx of webhooks coming from these platforms. You need typically a message queue. You want to make sure your servers don't get overloaded. So there's quite a few elements that go into it when you start using it at larger scale. And we realized that a lot of these companies were actually building webhooks over and over again, building these solutions over and over again. So we decided to offer it as a service. And as to why I decided to join HookDeck, well, that's a kind of a funny story. Alex likes to say that I kind of recruited myself,
and you sure did.
That's pretty funny.
So Alex and I started talking. We were introduced by a very good common friend, and we started talking about, I don't know what was it, Alex, like a year ago, something like that, maybe a little longer than that even. And I started kind of advising on the service, and I loved it so much. I mean, it was so radically different than what I did in the past working for enterprises, right? Where you focus on one single thing and one single feature and one single product. As you know, I used to do product management in the other part of my career, and I just I was ready for a new challenge, and then this one really sounded awesome, and I work with two awesome people, Alex and Eric, so I decided to jump on board. It was in my space. It was my expertise. I worked a lot with cloud services and middleware and infrastructure, and it sounded like a really good fit.
Yeah, that sounds great. And Alex, I'll bring you in to kind of talk as well about the vision for the company. And I see this all the time. Someone, a developer, a business person, someone in some organization sees something happening and they realize, wait a minute, this is a gap in the marketplace. Let's build something and solve this problem, because in most IT shops, we all have 24 hours in a day. You can't do more than you could possibly do. And so when you're always building things yourself, it's a classic build versus buy argument. But once a particular space or domain becomes mature, you get tools for it. So you don't have to build it yourself, right? Reinventing wheels is a pretty unproductive, expensive time. So tell us a bit about how you got the idea and where you guys are going with this.
Yeah, totally. So let me take it from the start. So as you described, I was exactly in this situation. I used to be a CTO for e-commerce company, and we were receiving millions of webhooks from Shopify, Stripe, Intercom, and a couple of folks like that. And as a CTO of a fashion brand, like how much time can you really justify spending like building a webhook infrastructure? And when I say webhook infrastructure, like we usually imply ingestion services. So that's everything that's going to receive the webhooks reliably. Then the queues, the message queues are going to process those asynchronously. Then the workers are going to consume from those queues. And then everything that comes around like a proper production system. So like the logging, the alerting, dealing with dead layer queues, all that stuff. So the replayability and so on. So being in those shoes, I really couldn't justify like taking my team and spend like, 3 months of time on this operating a fashion company. Like it really has nothing to do to like the value that we bring to the table.
Right.
So it was just a really frustrating experience to be left with like no good solution whatsoever. And almost to kind of like mess with us, I guess we got just a little bit of a taste from Stripe, because Stripe is actually kind of well known in this industry. They try to be kind of like the gold standard in everything they do, and like webhooks is one of those cases where out of all the SaaS platform out there, Stripe really gives you like the most tool. In my opinion, it doesn't go nearly as far enough, and we've kind of like realized that as we were building UGDEC, like the amount of possibility that you have to simplify people's life, but Stripe gave you just a little bit, right? And getting that from Stripe kind of just left me really wanting for more from Shopify and from Intercom and so on. And kind of like all of that germinated into what is now UGDEC. And the beauty of it is that UGDEC really is agnostic to the provider and to your tech stack. And the way that works is that UGDEC essentially acts as a proxy and a push queue in your service. So it's really generalized. As long as you can receive or send HTTP post requests, you're good to go. And when I kind of like saw the beauty of this, like to me, it was kind of a no-brainer that we needed to jump in and try to build something for that. Yeah, so far it's proven like we might have hit it on the nail. So I'm pretty happy about that. In terms of like a little bit kind of the vision for UGDEC or where it fits in the world, like I think Maurice was really accurate and like why we needed to build UGDEC, but like a little bit more of the meta picture of this is that every single technical team now is integrating with a ton of different SaaS, and we know that's like the world we live in. Like the work of a CTO is kind of almost as much picking the right SaaS than like managing the technical team internally. And I think that makes sense, right? The team internally wants to work on things that are specific to that business, that brings value to that business, and not reinventing the wheel like you mentioned.
Right.
And just like the raw amount of webhooks going out and being consumed is increasing exponentially, and there's no sign of this stopping anytime soon. So it just kind of boggles my mind that every technical team would re-implement exactly the same things, right? So really the thing that I find kind of like interesting about this whole thing is that we're in many ways kind of connecting third-party systems to internal systems, and those those tools to manage those communications between microservices and between services in the same architecture are pretty well established. So you're gonna have a lot of like Kong or Istio or tools like that to do networking and mesh networking within your own infrastructure. But when it comes to third party, you're kind of left in the cold because none of those tools are really compatible with it. And that kind of comes in and bridge that gap between like what are third party services and your internal infrastructure for everything that's asynchronous, right? So webhooks are by nature asynchronous events, and that's really what we want to try to focus on. And last thing I'll add is that I'm a little bit allergic to all the complexity that you get from AWS or GCP and all those platforms that you literally need to get degrees in to work with. So UGDEC is a really core focus on the whole developer experience. So that means how easy is it to pick up, which like really should be under 2 minutes, and how practical is it in your day-to-day? Like when you get an error and you're trying to figure out what's going wrong with your server, you shouldn't need to have like a degree in AWS to be able to figure out what's that error and how I can resolve it. So we come in and try to really make it like as simple and as accessible as possible, because we don't believe it should be anybody's job to be a specialist at UGDEC. Any developer or tech team should be able to use it without needing like a form, like specific classes or whatever to get going with it. So that's really a core focus of ours as well.
Yeah, and I think that the addressable market here is huge for a variety of reasons. One of which because there are so many software as a service applications now, and managing 3, 5, 7, 12 of them if you're a large organization gets to be kind of intense. And if I'm hearing you correctly, you talk about Stripe, for example, and some of these other very common apps that are being used. And what HookDeck is doing is I guess facilitating the orchestration of data movement from those different SaaS environments to your on-prem environment, and really helping to create a cohesion between those worlds. Is that right?
Yeah, that's totally accurate. One thing on your first point about it being a large addressable market, I've yet managed to explain to my mom exactly what I'm doing, and she writes like all of my blog posts and doesn't really get it. Still proud, but doesn't really get it. Um, and the thing that I get pretty recurringly is that Deck is a niche product. And I really don't think Deck is a niche product. It just requires this big amount of like expertise, or like there's a it's domain specific to
Hmm.
technical teams, but almost every technical teams in most companies do rely on webhooks nowadays. Actually, one thing that really surprised me, just last week I was talking with a marketer working for a big SaaS company, and we had already talked with their technical team about getting a deck in and so on, and there's back and forth going on. But when I talked to the marketer, I didn't realize that his growth team is actually using a ton of webhooks too, and the CTO of that company like didn't really realize that, or didn't
Huh.
really communicate that. And their growth team has huge need for UGDEC because they haven't spent any of the time building the infrastructure or anything like that. While their actual core product team has built some of that stuff themselves already, right? So in those moments, I realized that the addressable market is potentially even bigger than I realized, because you get all of those kind of like somewhat technical folks that are also using those tools. So in this case, like they had growth engineers like using it inside the company, right? So I think you're completely correct in your statement. And then regarding bridging, kind of like the third party for the first party, um, that's very much what we want to try to focus on. That being said, and I do want to leave space for others in the sense that like I think there's very two types of transactions that happen with those third party. There's going to be everything that's asynchronous and everything that's synchronous.
Hmm.
So in our case, like there's a lot of tools going on to help you with synchronous workflows. We're really trying to capture the asynchronous, and I think that's the part that's been most kind of like unexploited so far. And that's mainly because everything was built synchronously, and we're introducing that asynchronicity as time goes on. And Webhook is pretty much like the main way this is being done. And like Webhook is not really a standard; it's more kind of like a convention. So there's no specific specs of how this is supposed to happen. So you introduce additional complexity that to the opposite of like REST APIs and GraphQL APIs, or you have good expectations of how they're going to work. There's definitely quirks in webhooks where some platforms will decide to do a specific end shake when you register a new endpoint, and those end shake are not going to be the same shape from one provider to another. You're going to have other issues where they might send the data in different format. They might decide to implement security different ways. They might have different expectations on how much time you have to reply. For instance, like what's the timeout they allow. So you end up with like a whole mess where basically you need to learn each of those platforms individually versus just getting to a REST API. It's like, okay, well, here's my REST API. What's the rate limit? What's the authentication schema? Everything else I can pretty much expect from just reading, their API docs, but it's fairly intuitive of how things gonna work. With webhooks, there's really no way around kind of like digging through the docs, looking at sample payloads, like are they formatted the same way that they're formatted in the REST API? Is there any specific quirk to that implementation? Like Twitter, for instance, has a very convoluted way of doing handshakes, and all that stuff you can't really work around other than just like looking through the docs and trying to learn that quirk of that API. On that note, we're actually trying to build I call it almost like the Webhook Bible, where we're trying to document each of the platform different quirks, and kind of like format that recently. And Milius and I were on a call just 2 days ago, and myself, I was looking into what the Shopify timeout is because I had forgot. and I Googled Shopify timeout webhooks, and it was actually UGDEC that showed up. And
Nice.
Google pulled out the answer, which is 5 seconds, out of our own webhook Bible. And at that moment, I'm like, okay, we've got something going. that was pretty
That's
rewarding.
awesome. Talking to Alexander Bouchard and Maurice Karlakian of HookDeck. These are web hooks, and maybe I'll bring Maurice back in to comment on this. You know, it's funny because there's an old saying that someone comes along, they found a niche in the market, and it's half the market. And I kind of think that's what you guys are on to, the beginning of the other side of how to orchestrate this, because, you know, there's a great quote by, what's his name? He's a sort of a psychologist, Dr. Phil. Yeah, Dr. Phil. He says things happen for one reason and continue for another, right? And so we kind of figured out this API thing. And I remember in the old days, it used to be SOAP. They said it was going to be Simple Object Access Protocol, SOAP. And everyone said, no, we don't think so. We're going REST. Thanks anyway. And almost everyone went REST. And you see this with the APIs too, right? So there's all the people hitting APIs, but now it's just crazy the amount of just information that's flying out there because of all these apps and because of how we design apps now. Hitting GitHub, for example, I see that GitHub uses webhooks, Stripe, Facebook, other big companies using webhooks. So, you know, they figured something out, because when push comes to shove, you have to get things done. Performance is key. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine, a very smart guy, Sarbjeet Johal, and he was talking about the success of Facebook and why they succeeded versus MySpace and some of the others. And he said one of the main theories is it's very fast, it's snappy, boom, it just goes. So they figured that out. They said, look, people want performance, they want to get their stuff now, they don't want to wait. And of course, Google's now even, I'm pretty sure, penalizing websites that have slow response times. So at the end of the day, whatever your business is, if you are in the software as a service world, you're going to want to look into this stuff. Maurice, I'll throw it back over to you. I think that this is just the beginning of the webhook craze. What do you think?
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, I think something that you said that got me thinking. You talked about SOAP, and we talked about SOAP being the gold standard, but I remember poring over hours of documentation on figuring out what a SOAP envelope is and what some of the intricacies of the SOAP protocol are, and it was just painful. And I mean, you know, mainly on I used to do it with Microsoft, and I remember this was like, I'm talking what, 15, 14 years ago, when I had to integrate with like an ERP, a Microsoft ERP or something like that.
Right.
And I mean, have you seen Microsoft product documentation? It's extensive and it's good, but man, is it expensive. So I think the reason why, partly why webhooks were successful, is because people are also looking for simplicity, right? And why not webhooks? I'm sorry, why REST APIs were successful and were successful over SOAP is because people were looking for simplicity. They said, you know what, we have a great protocol already, HTTP. Let's use the foundations of HTTP and create something that we can map onto HTTP. So we use the HTTP verbs, we use JSON, which is a much more readable format than XML. And I think, you know, I think you'll all agree to the fact that you can read JSON much more easily than, or readily, that you can read XML. Where in most cases you use a parser.
Right. No,
there you go.
But that's a good example. I'm glad you brought that up, because I also am old enough to remember when it was going to be XML. XML came out, you know, and it was a great deal. Everyone's like, yes, this is the answer. And then JSON just took off, and people were like, yeah, and it's very similar. It's a hierarchical structure, right?
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, you know, critical number of people said, we're going this direction. And guess what?
Yeah.
We're going that direction.
And you're like, what do you mean HTML? I can write HTML with my known tags. That's awesome. And we thought that this was great until JSON came along. But the point here is that I think you have a natural convergence to whatever is easier, right? And webhooks is not different, because you have HTTP. HTTP was there already, and it was a means to an end for these companies, where they wanted to introduce rate limiting because they didn't want to overload their servers, but at the same time, they wanted to provide something simple that everybody would be able to implement. Now, I think it went a little bit too much on the other end, in the sense that there was no standard and that everybody kind of interpreted the webhook and implemented or has their own version of webhooks, which is one thing that we're, you know, hoping to tackle with HookDeck, trying to aggregate a lot of that information and standardize it. That's more of a long-term vision. But the point remains that you're going, like, we're trying to make things simpler, and it's as simple. Like, it doesn't get any simpler than HTTP call, which is why all these companies adopted the standard of sending HTTP notifications, because it's a fire and forget, right? I mean, all they have to do is just literally keep a list of the subscribers that they have to send the HTTP request to, send it, and they're done. They don't have any tracking to do. They don't have any, in most cases, they don't do any errors. They don't do any retries. Some of them do. Some providers do, and some providers are good about it. The vast majority don't, right? So that's where, like you said, and like you so accurately observed when we started talking, where there is it's a niche that grows, and it becomes like, when everybody uses it, it becomes a space where you can play in, and you can really create tools to help companies.
Yeah, something I'd like to add to that, if you don't mind, really quickly, is that webhooks appear really simple on the surface, but there's actually a lot of intricacies that make them fairly complicated to use in production or at scale. So the thing is, like, most platform and documentation will say, like, here, it's super simple, just put like your HTTP endpoint that we'll post to you and kind of like call it a day, right? But the thing is, like, there's many things that happen after you've you've added this URL. And all of those things are not things that you're very used to doing with a REST API. So let me give you like a very good example where the first issue with webhooks is you don't control the throughput at which you get them, right? So if Shopify has some outage on a couple of workers and they respawn and they work through their queues of tasks to accomplish, and they do it quickly because they're trying to like catch up with the back pressure, they're going to be sending a ton of webhook your way, and they don't really care about what your infrastructure is and like what's your ability of being able to receive those. That's your problem, right? But that means, like, for some customers, we see spikes where the request per second is going to jump to like 200, 250 requests per second, while they're usually at like 1 or 2 requests per second, right? So it's not everybody that is built or has the expertise to have built their infrastructure in a way where it can live through that, right? And we talked to a bunch of e-commerce companies, e-commerce SaaS, where during Black Friday, just everything goes on fire because there's just too many webhooks coming through their servers, and that's like a recurring issue, right? So that's one thing, but there's multiple, and I won't jump into all the specifics, but there's so many reasons why it is more complex. And another one is you don't control what the payload is either, right? So you're going to get arbitrary data. You don't control what the shape of that data is going to be. It might change in between the last time that you got it and the time that you got it now. And those are all the type of issues where you essentially need to put a bunch of work, the same way that we kind of like all learn to work with REST and build around that. Like, now you need to learn to work around webhooks and asynchronicity. And like, that's basically why we built Exec, right? We're trying to, and as Mogus was saying so well, we're trying to like remove all of those quirks or things that make webhook hard, and really boil it down to what it is proposed as, just a HTTP endpoint. We're trying to kind of make that vision true, let's put it that way.
That's interesting. Can you give some examples of like when Stripe uses webhooks, what are they, what kind of notifications are they sending? Is it we got the money? Is it we got the product? Or what's the nature of the data that gets sent in a webhook typically?
Yeah, so typically webhooks are going to be segmented by what are referred like as topics or events. So generally you'll get to subscribe to specific things that you want. So using Stripe, you might have like subscription created, subscription updated, subscription canceled. You might have a webhook before a renewal for that subscription. I'm using like the billing context here, but you know, it's also true for charges. So a charge that went through, or a fraud event detected, or iRisk event detected. And the Shopify list of topic is extremely extensive. And most platforms are usually pretty good with their topics. That's usually where the segmentation stops though. You can't say like, okay, I want a webhook for a subscription with that specific customer. Usually you can't go that specific, or maybe perhaps with like a specific product or value for the subscription renewal, or and so on, right? And that data in Stripe case and in many platform case is going to be very, very similar to what you get from the REST API. And sometimes you might get to pick like the API version or the webhook version that you want, and that usually reflects pretty well with the API, the REST API version for that same kind of object. And that's the data that you're going to get and you're going to work with.
Okay, and then I'm also thinking to myself, there are similarities here, even when you talk about topics, for example, to streaming engines like Kafka. So you've got the asynchronous stuff that with these webhooks, You have REST calls, API calls, via REST. That's very common. Can you differentiate between your approach and what someone might get or use with a Kafka or this Flink and Pulsar? And in the old days, you had MQ series and all these messaging queues. What's the difference in terms of the nature of the technology with respect to webhooks, Alexander?
Yeah, sure. So the big difference is that the event bus or the queue or the pub sub or whatever you want to call it, that's really just one part of what we're building. So UGDEC will replace that Kafka or RabbitMQ or pub sub or SQS, you name it, in your infrastructure to handle event asynchronously. So UGDEC will behave itself as a queue. But the thing is with Webhook, that's really just a small chunk of the work that you got to do, because you also need to have your ingestion services. So that's going to be things that are going to be taken in those events and actually registering them or pushing them into that stream. And then you're going to need those consumers that consume from that stream, right? And generally speaking, with those consumers come complexity, because you need to scale the amount of consumers based on the depth of your queue, for instance. That's going to be, and if you're not using things like Kubernetes and so on, that might get pretty tricky to put together. And you're also going to have just problems around, okay, well, how do I deal with my replayability? What happens when events don't succeed and so on? There is some queue that will have some mechanism, like generally speaking, you'll see things like dead letter queues where events will accumulate into, but then there's also the question of like, okay, well, my dead letter queue is now filled up. What do I do with this, right? And what went wrong? Why is the event in the dead letter queue in the first place? And those are things where like all the different queue services are not going to help you. So UGDEC will behave as that queue, but will capture the full pipeline of work that you need to do to essentially be successful on that webhook event. And like specifically what I mean by that is that we'll ingest all the events coming in, react a little bit as a proxy essentially between the third party and your service. Then we'll queue all of those. One particularity of the UGDEC queue is that you can actually see everything that's in it, the state of it, and you can alter the state, do things like retry it right now, change a retry date, bulk retry, a bunch of stuff that match specific conditions. So you might want to say, okay, well, everything that I got a 502 on because my server was down because of some unrelated outage and I missed those webhook, I want all of those and I want to replay them now because I know my server is up, right? You can also do things like interrupt the stream with a pause. So you can pause the connection where all the event or your stream will essentially accumulate until you unpause it, at which point when you unpause it, then it's going to start kind of like going through everything that it received that was on hold and deliver that. So there's many ways that you can actually play with the data that's in your queue that you're not going to get through other services. And that's something that like can be helpful in other contexts than just webhooks, but applies very well to webhooks. And along with that, you get all kind of like the troubleshooting details. So what did your endpoint return and all that kind of stuff. And then the next part is that you can actually receive that data the same way you would a normal webhook. And you don't need specific consumers. That means it scales the same way that like a generic API would scale, right? So if you're scaling your API based on CPU usage or memory usage, or depending on your application, that will work out of the box with UGDEC. There's no notion of like, what's the depth of queue and so on, because we're behaving as a push queue instead of a pull queue. So it reduces a lot of the burden and complexity in deployment and operationalizing the whole infrastructure. So I guess those are the main points. We also have like all the alerts and logging and so on. I guess logging I kind of touched upon, but the alerts and so on baked in. And then there's going to be the bells and whistles, but that's a whole category of just like nice to have convenient feature that we've added on top.
Very, very cool stuff. We're talking to Maurice Bouchard and Alexander Bouchard and Maurice Kralakian of UGDEC.